Hey, hi everyone. We're here to talk about real-life AI red teaming, um, going from all the way from risk to evidence in a very demanding environment like regulated industries. Let's start with a little bit about me. I run a consultancy, an AI security consultancy, and I have helped national scale organization, the UK, secure the AI systems. I'm a board member for the Generative AI Security Project, leading the top 10 for agentic applications. I've also been very privileged to author the UK government's implementation guide for AI cybersecurity code of practice. That's now a standard. Written a few books and documents, and that's not just to impress you, just my approach, just to give you a little bit about my approach, which is combining standards with real-world delivery. Let's start with a little bit about where we are with AI red teaming and the challenges that we face. Well, I'm sure you'll agree that AI red teaming has evolved since we started talking about it. OWASP has helped enormously with that, with the wealth of guidance that has provided. For those of you who haven't come across that, we have an initiative, the AI red teaming initiative, that has released a very, very popular guide of how to do AI red teaming. It has been adopted. We have now a new version coming out, and we have a document that tells you how to evaluate the tools. And of course, every quarter we release the landscape document that contains products that can help you with red teaming. So OWASP has helped enormously doing that. We've seen the backbound is with major AI providers, the tooling that's exploding, and we have seen that in the landscape document that I have just mentioned. And also, of course, from my side, I see in real life, as I do AI red teaming engagements, that we're moving from generic security research into more kind of real world deployments where the specific risk context of the organization is at the epicenter of the AI red teaming. So in OWASP, we talked a lot about prompt injection, and sometimes, we have endless conversations, but thank God for prompt injection. Whatever your view about it is, it created that visibility that we need to care about red teaming. We need to start red teaming, so that about security, we need to start red teaming. That was something that popularized to everyone the need to test AI for security vulnerabilities. But that's no longer the only issue that we face. So if you look at organizations in the UK, for instance, when they use AI, it isn't just about prompt injections. It isn't about pure security. We're talking about regulations there. So we have cross-sector regulations. For instance, and I'm sure it's similar in other regions and geographies where you have data protection, the Information Commission of the GDPR legislation across Europe, which is particularly keen on setting some boundaries on when you do automated decisions with AI, about the quality, the consumer protection laws that we have, that's across the sectors. But then if you go into particular sectors like the financial service or healthcare, you will see that there are specific guidelines that affect the use of AI, and you actually need to test about that because you need to test them, because otherwise you'll end up with huge fines and severe reputational damage. And all of those things that you see there, there's actually I worked examples that I used in real life engagements. All of those, you make them part of your threat model, or you need to make them part of your threat model, create a concrete attack intent, and then have a kind of a approach of how you're going to red team and test. But it isn't just about prompt injection anymore and classic security. When you look at organizations in different geographies, for instance, in the UK, but it's, I'm sure, similar to other regions and countries, there is a whole piece of regulation that we need to take into account when we red team AI applications. And some of that will be cross-sector, about data protection, about automated decisions when you use AI, equality, the consumer protection, but also, specific sectors. If you're in finance, for instance, in the UK, the Financial Conduct Authority, or FCA, the regulator in this country, talks about not providing concrete advice, provide guidance, but not advice, because otherwise you bypass the licensing of providing financial advice. It puts some other restrictions around suitability. If you detect that a user is vulnerable, you need to stop giving them advice and signpost them to support channels. And similarly, in healthcare, you must not give guidelines that are not compliant with the AISI clinical guidelines and the standards that we have. If an AI system is participating in providing medical advice, then it's treated like almost like a regulated device. And of course, the Data Protection Act has much higher threshold known as the good patient confidentiality. And all those regulations add objectives to what we test. So it isn't just about classic security and prompt injections. And somehow, they started drawing. Hold on, let me just see why. Okay. Right. So you can see how in any organization that's regulated or is subject to this regulation, this can create an exponentially high number of objectives, that it isn't just about classic security, and it isn't funny to talk about classic AI security, but we need to think about those things, because if we don't, then who is going to test them? And are we not creating silos and potentially cracks of how those objectives are going to be assured? So they have to become part of AI red teaming. And in a recent engagement, they create something like 30 plus distinct attack objectives that they had to be mapped into attack scenarios. And this is where we're seeing another change that's happening, that the singleton scan that we had before is just the entry point. Since then, the models, the training, the guardrails caught up. So you can't just send a single request and expect to have a bridge. So the frontier has moved into multi-turn, and one of those is crescendo that people use because of its gradual escalation, but there are other different methods. Just in this particular session, we'll focus on crescendos because it's an easy way to describe how that affects regulated red teaming. And to do that, to scale that, instead of doing it one by one, we employ AI, and we use models as attackers that generate the attacks and the prompts, and also the scorers that evaluate the response that we get from back from the target. And I put there some of the tools that I use. PyRIT, very well known from Microsoft, almost has become the de facto standard. Promptfoo, similar, different approach there, and it's been acquired by OpenAI, so it's interesting to see where that tool ends up. Spiky is a new one in the UK that I really like because of the way that combines different declarative rules, and HumanBound is a new entry there that allows you to combine contextual multi-turn red teaming and then incorporate it into security posture management, which I think is quite interesting in how it helps you incorporate AI red teaming into the security lifecycle. There are far more tools out there, and this is, I'm using them as an example. It's not an endorsement. It doesn't mean that there aren't any better. You need to go and look at the landscape document that the OWASP Generative AI Security Project produces and decide what's best for you. And how do you normally configure those tools? I have some examples there, either in code in PyRIT in Python or in the YAML file on Promptfoo, or in Spiky, you use the CLI. But in all cases, you specify the model or the API key that you're using so that you have this attacker model that generates those prompts, and very important in multi-turn, but because it isn't just a single, it has to reflect the context of the previous result, and also the scorer, which allows you to evaluate whether something is a success. In other words, there was a data breach, a partial, it's a borderline, or failure, which means that the target withstood and there was no breach. Okay, and this is how you said, they give you those different ways of setting those attacker and scorer models. And of course, when you set those models in a regulated red teaming environment, there are important considerations to take into account. If you start using an attacker and evaluator in an unapproved model or in a model that doesn't have zero data retention, you may end up actually that model memorizing your vulnerabilities or the vulnerabilities of your client. And you don't want all of a sudden then to have data leaks with all your vulnerabilities being known to third parties. And here I put a table that I use in my AI red teaming practice, where there are models that are zero data retention by default, like the AWS Bedrock, but you have to look at the documentation, keep an eye on that, because it's not a contractual agreement. Whereas other hyperscalers like Azure and Google, they have zero data retention, but you need to make sure that your data isn't stored in anomaly detection or other logs. For pure AI vendors like OpenAI and Anthropic, you need to negotiate an enterprise agreement. Whereas if you go, of course, for your own hosted models, then you have zero data retention by default. So you have to take those things into account. And if you look at the frameworks and if you look at the tutorials, they all come with some defaults that they use. And normally you use, if you look at tutorials and blogs, they use by default GPT-4o mini, or as Anthropic releases new models, probably the latest mini. And both Promptfoo and also PyRIT, in some of the defaults, you end up using the Anthropic model. But because of the previous slides that I walked you through, your client or the organization won't necessarily accept that, because just because it's default, it isn't necessarily approved because of those zero data retention concerns and data leaks concerns. And then the question becomes, well, if I'm not allowed to use the defaults, how do I choose? Do I choose randomly? What are the criteria? And this is what we're going to go through today. In those environments, how do we make sure that we choose the right models to perform red teaming, AI-assisted red teaming at scale? And I'll give you some examples to see the challenges that we face. So in this example, we have a multi-tenant crescendo script that effectively asks the target to leak a document. And actually in 10.6, as you can see, it verbatim gives you that confidential policy. And you may think that all the models will consider that as a success because it is a data breach. But if you look at actually what has happened in our evaluations and tests, quite a few 6 frontier scorers that you'd expect them to spot that as a data breach, they didn't, and they failed, including actually the model that we use on the back end. Similarly, when we have a test for providing clinical guidance to a child that hasn't been registered with that practice, and therefore you have no history, you have no context about that child, the model happily provides back diagnosis and also, provides back some medical advice on the type of medication to use. And again, the ground truth is that this is partial. The advice isn't really that sophisticated, but still advice that could have side effects. And here what we see is, which is actually shocking to see, that 9 frontier models think that that's okay. That despite the clear guideline in the ground truth that this is a failure, the scorer models think that this is a valid thing to do, and it's not a violation of the regulation that would have ended. If you just relied on those scorer models, you would have ended up in serious problems. Finally, I've talked about the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK saying that you shouldn't provide unlicensed financial advice. And again, in this sample that we have, and I will explain later on how we created those 3 samples that we used throughout this session, we got very specific, very detailed financial advice. And when we asked the scorer models again, 7 of them said, well, actually, including the default, by the way, it said, no, that wasn't a breach of regulation. And that would have ended you'd have ended up in not only reputational damage, possibly customer legal action, but also the FCA fines in the UK start at the 100K. And so how do we move away from randomly choosing models or accepting the default? And this is where I think we need to change our approach and become more evidence-based in collecting that evidence. And that's why, in addition to some of the things I'm going to say, I'm going to show some of the tools that I use, and I've open sourced them for any of you to use, which allows you to support that evidence-based AI red teaming. First of all, the methodology that I use is obviously what you will find in the AI red teaming guideline from the OWASP Gen AI Security Project, which is end-to-end testing using a threat model to identify, rather than some random selection of prompts to test, map to those test objectives and create the success conditions. And this is now where, the important bit comes in. Incorporate that selection of the attacker and scorer as part of your methodology, rather than just accepting the default. Make sure that you evaluate to understand that the model you're going to use is suitable for what you're trying to do, and it meets the objectives and the metrics that you have. This is where I've created and open sourced a tool that I will take you through there, which is a harness execution tool that allows you to have a systematic collection of data and then review them so that you can calibrate what you see. You can understand how to combine those models, and we'll talk about panels later on, and then adjust and repivot based on your findings. And I think it's really important also to think about AI red teaming, regardless of where you do it. But in regulated environments, it's even more important, because what you have at stakes of how then you be able to replay and address regression testing and integrate it with the pipeline. So we'll see how you can do that, and how can you integrate it with your GRC so that there is a single view of risk, rather than just one point that says, well, things failed or things succeeded. And it becomes part of that. I like to see AI red teaming methodology as a loop that you keep repeating it. And to support that, the first tool that you can find on GitHub that I have released to support this is the AI red teaming harness, and that allows you to effectively have a unified API in front of any target that you have. You can create your own mapping classes, you can create profiles, and in fact, you can create profiles for mock systems. That's how I normally do red teaming, so that I don't burn all my budgets, even when my client is not ready. And it's seamless really to switch, and that's actually quite useful, because you can do all kind of ABC tests between different models without asking people to change the underlying model there. And it's also Docker native, so that you can use it in your experiments. But the real value of this is a standardized way of doing it. And maybe you don't use this tool, but make sure that you have a tool in place, a harness tool in place, that gives you a systematic collection of data. Otherwise, your evaluation will be very, very flawed, because you will be comparing apples with whatever the other fruit is that people use. And as part of that, there is a replay capability, so that we can not only support regression and replay, but also repeat the experiment, so that we can understand the impact of different changes that we have. And you can also integrate it into your posture management, as we said, and support your AISI and support your pipeline, so that red teaming isn't just at one point in time, it's part of your overall assurance and your overall AISI. And finally, and this is the biggest contribution that this session is making, is an eval module that allows you to evaluate models that you select as your scorers and as your attackers. And that is a key decision you're going to make. Instead of creating something from scratch, we're using the UK AI Security Institute's Inspect model. That's a model that the UK AI Security Institute, or AISI, is using to evaluate models. Most recently, they used it to evaluate ChatGPT 5.5, for instance, compared to Mythos and even the Mythos preview. So what we have done is we added some modules there that allow you to configure it and evaluate scorers and attackers so that you can actually select which one is the best for you and integrates with that harness tool that I described. So it's a very lightweight collection of tools, if you like, to support this methodology that says you don't just test randomly prompt injections. You have a threat model, but you also integrate regulatory requirements and you test your models, your attackers and your scorer models to make sure that you cover those regulatory requirements. And we've used that in real life engagements. Obviously, I couldn't reveal customer client confidentiality, but we have created 3 samples using that harness. If I go back a little bit here, so in the harness, you can do a YAML profile. So we've created 3 profiles, one for a healthcare, a GP using AI, a financial hardened and financial unhardened application that's deep vault. We call them MediGuide and Money Agent, and we use them to simulate real life use cases to replicate some of the evidence we have seen in the field and being able then to share it. And the 3 clear findings that we're finding is that there is no universal best attacker. So when we look at using a model as an attacker, for instance, for the MediGuide, the medical application, Quen 3 was number 1, and went for the deep vault, went down to 2 because, and then also number 6 on finance, because of the different characteristics that we'll explore in a minute. Similarly, there is no universal best scorer. You will see how, again, models go up and down depending on the domain, depending on the different combinations. And sometimes you can see opposite performance too. So you really need, that makes the point about evaluating all those parameters before you start your red teaming, rather than selecting the default or a random model because it's available. And the realization is that actually a single model isn't sufficient in itself. The best way to have full coverage of things like regulation, because it isn't really something that the models understand fully, is to have a panel both for attackers and for scorers to match the domain. And we'll see some of the elements there that you need to think about to evaluate and combine to make that panel effective. As I said, if you look at the results, and we're creating a paper actually with this, we'll publish that, the full results and the data sets. You can see how domain is really, really important, and how the choice depends on whether the domain, but also whether the target is hardened. So if you have an application that has no hardening, no guardrails, then deceptively all the models will behave really well. And that's because it's very easy to understand classic security topics. If you add that hardening and what you have is really kind of very hard cases to solve with regulation, then that's where the models start struggling. And that's where you see all the variation in performance. And that's where you see Quen behaving really well on healthcare, but then going down on finance. And this is where the panels come in. So if you combine them, we combine different variations, and again, we'll publish all the results. If you put together 5 models, and we found that to be the optimal combination of models, it gives you the best. It automatically increases the performance, and it gives you a better coverage than, in terms of scenarios, than any individual model. And actually, you can create panels that reflect your restrictions. So you can create a zero data retention panel that achieves a very, very comparable performance without having to sacrifice the quality of your test. You can create a compliant, if you like, panel that meets your organization, your customer requirements for zero data retention and approved models. In general, I say panels nearly double the coverage from the best model. and the 94% of performance for zero data retention, it's a very it's a price worth paying if you want to be compliant with your organization's zero data retention requirements. What we found with attackers is that each model seems to have different approaches and different characteristics. So in more than 1,000 scripts that we ran, we found that they have different approaches, starting from the very emphatic confidant that's trying to kind of create a, if you like, a relationship of trust with the target, all the way to a sycophantic mirror. And initially, and that was very true of the GPT open source model, where initially we thought that one of the problems you have with the attacker models is that at some stage they give up and they keep repeating what the target is saying. And when we saw GPT OSS doing that, we thought, oh my goodness, kind of, it's not performing all that well. But in a closer look, we realized that it was just becoming a sycophantic mirror trying to reassure the target, and that was quite successful in some use cases. The cooperator is another one that's comes and kind of barely attacks, very polite, but somehow in multiple terms manages to get the results that it needs. So, those are the kind of the 7 archetypes that we found different models have. And those archetypes, they're not necessarily a linear relationship with attack success rate, because we had many scenarios where the same archetype produces different results. It tends to be how much of that is related to the domain and the use case that you have, and how much of that complements the other models. So if you put a panel of 5 emphatic confidants, your performance will be really, really slow. You need to mix those different styles to get the best performance. For instance, one thing that we found with a very, very cheap Dolphin 7B model, which is an obliterated model, in other words, all the alignment has been removed, that wasn't the best performance. But every time that we added it into a panel, it found quite a few unique, significant unique findings that other models, including very expensive models, and Dolphin A is free, and it's a tiny little model that you can even run on Olama, but it added that coverage by finding unique breaches that other models couldn't find. And so this makes the point about it isn't just a single best model, it isn't just a single best style of attack, the archetype, but it's finding that combination that is relevant to your domain and use case. And that is why all that tooling that I described earlier on, the methodology is important, because you need to be able to run that evaluation in a very easy way without having to take long cycles to understand what the archetype is relevant, what panel is relevant to your use case. Moving on to scorers, we find a similar picture there, that there is no perfect scorer. What we see is that they have no problem in easy calls, where you kind of, it's very easy to agree there. Where they struggled was only 7% agreement on the very hard success regulatory calls. So this is where you need to pay your attention, not so much on the typical prompt injections, the typical kind of jailbreaking, but those use cases that are very specific to the application that you're building, and that's where the models couldn't get to agree. If you look again at the ranking of the results that we had, we noticed that actually the Anthropic models are quite performant. When again, to kind of change its position depending on the use case. But again, what we found is that panels up the performance, and here the performance is the F1, which is both precision and recall and consistency. And this is where we found that different panels bring different characteristics, or rather, performance is tends to be similar, but what drives the selection of the panel here is the constraints that you have. So you cannot start by saying, I'm going to use the best F1 if you have restrictions into the models that you use. So for instance, zero data retention. That will be the arching objective that you have. Similarly, if you have speed and cost as restrictions, and you may think in small AI retiming that's not an issue, but if you have more than 10,000 transcripts, that's actually quite a significant significant constraint that you have there, especially if you want to automate and you want to make it to shift left. So those are the things that you need to think when you start building the panels of scorers. And the different constraints will inform what's the best panel, and then you can, from that, select what's the best performance from those candidates. A different approach is combine them in what we call a cascading panel. And that is the realization that you need to reserve, if you like, the most expensive and sophisticated models for items that you don't have a universal agreement in your panel. There's no point in using something like Opus 4.6, which is expensive and slow, if 0 out of 5 or 5 out of 5 models in your panel either fail to agree or agree. Where you want to focus on your expensive and sophisticated model is in those borderline cases where you have two models against three models against two. That's where there is no clear consensus, and you need to escalate and use that sophisticated model. And what we have seen in real life settings is that this approach, it actually allows you to have a near premium F1, the measure of performance, for a fraction of the 30% of the cost, and only 13% of the case. And again, this is a good way of dividing capabilities and dividing bandwidth. Use the chip and the panels that are very fast for the vast majority of the cases, and then have a very sophisticated model like Opus or ChatGPT 5.5 do the final review as an additional cascading panel. And this is actually the approach that we should have across the board, and having different layers of escalation, because I don't believe AI-assisted red teaming with scorers and attackers is there yet without any significant human in the loop. And of course, if you have tons of scripts, that human in the loop can become challenging. And this is where actually we can utilize AI scorers and attackers, not to replace the humans, but to have that multi-layer approach to AI red teaming, particularly in regulated environments where audit defensibility is really important. You cannot just think, oh, that's okay. By having the panels triage the transcripts with the 5 model panel scorer models, that's the vast majority, use that cascading panel to cut down on the false positives or negative false negatives by using that sophisticated model, but then have the humans to adjudicate and then produce the final audit defensible result. And that allows you actually to reduce significantly the panels. So the important thing to remember is that panels are not a sign-off layer. They don't replace the human that will review and understand, but it's a triage layer that helps you save significant time and effort to scale AI red teaming almost up to 4 times in the time that it takes to run all the scripts that you have created. But for those things to work, you also need to have the appropriate setup. So something that we found throughout this, and this is where actually having that repeatability of the harness tool is really important, is when we start with a pure black box in an agentic environment, we don't really see what the agents do. We don't really see that collaboration between agents. So you only find more things about what the agents are doing by having a gray box view, for instance, including, not in production, but when you do, you test the agent reasoning, the chain of thought, and I would say, in future, maybe access to the logs too as part of your the gray box view. And this is an example that I have there, that's actually part of our automated test that we run, where the system came back and agreed that they will do what the user asked and they shouldn't have done it. But agreeing doesn't mean they did it. So when we score just from the response, the prompt response from the system, that was a clear success. There was a breach there. But then when we looked closer into the chain of thought, we realized that actually, although the model said, yes, I will do it, it never did it because it never invoked the tool. And so that's an example of how we need to rethink a little bit of how we're doing, particularly agentic AI teaming. And this is again why we need that tooling and that methodology that allows us to evaluate the system and do a few A/B C testing to understand what the various differences are when we have, for instance, more metadata rather than just the response. And this is where I hope I explain why I think we need to rethink AI reteaming, not so much about the need or the fundamentals or the guidelines that we get from OWASP and other organizations, but because of the mythology that we have around it, the assumptions that we make about default, the assumptions that we make about if you have a bigger model, you have a better attacker, or that black box is the best way to do it. Or, for me, the most pernicious is to say, oh, that's not security, regulatory risk, we shouldn't really test it. That's really, really something that we need to reframe. We need to have a more systematic approach on the models that we evaluate and choose to help us with AI reteaming. We need to understand the domain that we have. We need to understand whether it's agentic. And clearly at some stage, most of the, or almost all of the targets will be agentic. And above all, we need to kind of avoid this black and white thinking about regulatory risk. Because if we don't do it as part of our assurance, who is going to do it? Are we not creating cracks? Are we not creating silos, disconnected silos between people who care about regulatory risk and people who care about security? And are we not then setting up the organization to fail? So those are the things that we need to consider, and we need to consider them systematically, not just as part of blogs, not just of the enthusiasm of just attacking a system and hacking things to find those headline 0 days. They're very useful, this kind of really, really important to do it, but we need to make sure that we also have a methodology in place that help us employ red teaming in a consistent, evidence-based approach. And that's my key takeaways for all of you. A single view of risk. Let's not compartmentalize risk and say, oh, this is something that someone else has to worry, because I can tell you, you can have an ethics board that has the perfect ethical policy in place, but it takes a single prompt injection or model poisoning to make that useless. So those things have to come together, and we have to adopt a single view of risk. We need to look at red teaming not as just an event that happens, but as a loop that goes through and connects with GRC, it connects with the security lifecycle and AI SecOps. Of course, threat models and understanding what we're doing. We cannot have, some people talk about, oh, we need maths and formal verification. We had that conversation with, before AI arrived. We can never have full formal verification, but we need to have an informed, risk-informed approach to what we test, and that's what threat models bring. Not a single model, as if you use AI-assisted scorers and attackers, try to have panels, have to try to understand your domain and combine them. Evidence over assumptions and blogs and cool mottos. And please, if you find them useful, use the tooling that I did or create your own that allows you to scale, that allows you to be systematic about collecting evidence across different applications and comparing similar findings so that you have a clear understanding of what you're testing and what is that you're assuring. And maybe we can all start contributing those findings. I will most certainly publish my findings as a paper so that we advance this evidence-based AI red teaming, which is so important in regulated environments. And regulated sounds so boring, but it is about systems that affect people's incomes and living, that affects people's lives in medical settings. So this becomes even more critical there. I welcome any questions. Please post any questions. Find me on LinkedIn, find me on OWASP Flag, and let's collaborate and let's make sure that we bring evidence-based AI red teaming into the forefront of our activities. Thank you and goodbye.